Good evening. Thank you for joining us for the Asala Howard Social Justice Consortium workshops. We'll begin tonight by hearing from Dr. Nikki Taylor of Howard University. Dr. Taylor, are you there?
Hi, I'm going to actually let my colleague, Dr. Bahia Muhammad, speak for Howard University. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Muhammad. Thank you.
Greetings, everyone, and good evening. It's such a pleasure to be back with you all again this week for what I know will be a wonderful session. Welcome to the Association for the Study of African American Life and History, ASALA Workshop Wednesdays, which is a free 5-part virtual series focused on the social justice community engagement. This is a collaborative effort presented by the renowned ASALA and the Howard University Social Justice Consortium. You had an opportunity to have a brief visit site from our fearless PI, Dr. Nikki Taylor, but tonight, scholar activist Dr. Lisa Brock has curated the sessions that you will not want to miss. Make sure that you registered for all of the upcoming sessions that are to come, as well as inviting a friend to come along. These sessions have been phenomenal and informative, and we have received great feedback from not only our students, but individuals who have been interested as part of the social justice community. I am Dr. Bahia Muhammad, Associate Professor of Criminology in the College of Arts and Sciences, Department of Sociology at Howard University, and I am honored to serve as the co-PI on the Mellon Foundation Just Futures grant that funds this specific project. Howard University is a historically Black private research university comprised of 14 schools and colleges. Our students pursue more than 120 areas leading to undergraduate, graduate, and professional degrees. Howard University operates with a commitment to excellence and truth and service. This series is brought to you by the Howard University Social Justice Consortium. Specifically, this is a cross-organizational, cross-institutional, interdisciplinary partnership that is concerned with educating society and developing the critical consciousness people need in order to analyze injustice in their own communities and to develop innovative and collaborative action-oriented remedies. The Social Justice Consortium has 3 specific pathways to increase community knowledge on this topic, and this includes supporting social justice research, art, and activism, but most importantly, it is the effort to democratize access to knowledge through courses dedicated to social justice. These specific courses will not only deepen community social justice knowledge, but position the humanities and the humanistic social sciences as a means to solve social problems. Education and empowerment across different sectors and demographics will increase the critical consciousness, participation in, and efficacy of social justice activism. This is why we are all here tonight. I see that we have individuals that are coming to us from all across the nation, New Jersey, South Carolina, Pennsylvania. Thank you all so much for joining us. We hope that you enjoy this workshop and that you'll enjoy us for all 5. Many of you have. I see that there are individuals in the chat that are returning. There will be a final 2 sessions that are held over the next few weeks, and that'll happen on October 6th as well as October 13th. Please also go to the Howard University Social Justice Consortium website, and I'll put that link in the chat so that you all can have an opportunity to learn more about the consortium and all about the wonderful HBCUs across the nation who serve as humanities faculty members of the consortium. In addition, the website will provide you information on ways that you can support this movement. Thank you so much for your time this evening. I hope that you have your notes and are ready to jot down questions and have a phenomenal learning experience. Peace and blessings.
Thank you so much, Dr. Muhammad. It is always good when you give us your remarks and set us off on our path for the night. And so now we'll hear from Dr. Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham, President of the Association for the Study of African American Life and History.
Greetings. I welcome you to the Social Justice Workshop 103 of the Association for the Study of African American Life and History, ASALH, as we call ourselves. This is the third of 5 Social Justice Workshop Wednesdays, led by the brilliant scholar and social activist, Dr. Lisa Brock. And our program is sponsored by ASALH as part of the Social Justice Consortium of Howard University, which Dr. Muhammad spoke of so beautifully. Howard is my own alma mater. In fact, it's also Lisa Brock's alma mater. This larger project, the Social Justice Consortium, under the PI, Nikki Taylor, as was said, was made possible by the Just Futures grant of the Mellon Foundation. And it speaks to ASALH's emphasis on dialogue between academia and the community. We are in conversation with teachers, faculty, and also local leaders of community organizations and conversations between old and young. And we are so happy this evening to have high school students with us. I want to give a special shout out to 16-year-old Jordan Atkins, the Social Justice Chair of Greater Essex County, New Jersey, chapter of Jack and Jill. Welcome, Jordan. I'm honored to introduce Marvin Delaney, William Marvin Delaney, the president-elect of ASALH. We are especially privileged to have our next ASALH president because he is a pioneering figure in social justice studies. And he is the author of the book, Black Police in America, which was published in 1996. So with that, I turn to ASALH's incoming president, W. Marvin Delaney.
Thank you, Dr. Higginbotham, and welcome to all of you. I'm pleased and honored to be a part of this social justice program, focusing on the history of police. I consider myself to have been part of the early Black Studies movement, starting in the late 60s and early 70s, in which we were creating a new discipline that would not just be academic, but would also solve problems in the African American community. And of course, one of the key problems we faced was criminal justice. And so as a young budding scholar working on a PhD, I thought I would address and attack the issue of criminal justice. So I specifically looked at policing because policing had always been a problem in our community. And it's sort of ironic, I was looking at it from the standpoint of there needed to be more police, that is, and more particularly more African-American police officers. So of course, further research showed me that indeed the police were the problem and that there needed to be some way to regulate the police and make them indeed serve our community. So I'm really looking forward to tonight's presentation by Dr. Brock, because indeed it's something I've been interested in for 50 years. And so with that said, let me turn it back over to Michelle.
Thank you, Dr. Delaney. So tonight, as you've heard, this is the third in our 5-part workshop, social justice workshop series. And tonight's workshop is, this is what democracy looks like. Street heat, nope, sorry. Tonight's workshop is history of policing in communities of color and its implication today. And I do want to once again remind you that this is an interactive session, and so we're hoping you will participate. And so please use the chat as you have been and introduce yourself. Tell us where you're from, what school you go to, and why you've decided to join us. And then if you will put your questions and answers in the Q&A section, we have a panel here that will be moderating the questions and sending them out to Dr. Brock. And we also will be using the raised hand function. And if there's something you would like to add or ask, please raise your hand and we'll try to recognize you and bring you on screen. And so without further ado, I'd like to turn you over to Dr. Lisa Brock, who will be guiding our presentation tonight. Hi, Dr. Brock. Thank you so much.
So thank you, Michelle. And I want to thank you and the Howard University Social Justice Consortium and the ASALA team for having me here today for this, my third and my final presentation, although I've been the curator I am the curator of the entire series. The next 2 weeks, we're going to continue the discussion of social justice struggles by bringing in grassroots activists who are actively working on issues of voting rights in the South and mass incarceration. And my hope in curating this series was that the first 3 that I've been doing would build your social justice toolbox in such a way that the final 2 sessions inspire you. You've got the knowledge, then you get the activists, and that you're ready to go, that you're going to be inspired to get involved wherever you are, and that you feel that you can. So I really am happy to be here. I go by she, her, hers. Now, before we begin, I want to acknowledge that I live in Chicago and am currently sitting in my house in the Beverly neighborhood of Chicago, which was originally made habitable by the Council of Three Fires. The land that I live on is stolen land, and I honor those whose ancestors were on this land before me. Chicago is located on the traditional unceded homelands of the Ojibwe, the Odawa, and the Potawatomi nations, known as the Council of Three Fires. Many other tribes, such as the Miami, Ho-Chunk, Menominee, Sauk, and Fox, also call this area home as well. The region has long been a center for indigenous people to gather, trade, and maintain kinship ties. Today, one of the largest urban American Indian communities in the United States is actually here in Chicago. Members of this community continue to contribute to the life of this city and to celebrate their heritage, practice traditions, and care for the land and waterways. For some of you, you may not have heard a land acknowledgement before, and for others, you may have heard it so much that it may seem performative and therefore lack oomph and meaning for you. I think it is performative, but like most rituals, we do it because it reminds us of where we come from and on whose shoulders we stand. This particular ritual should remind us each time we say it of this country's first inhabitants and its first pandemic, which was genocide, and that there continues to be land and lives stolen and taken among those that made the land inhabitable. And the question we should always ask ourselves each time we say it is, what should we do about it now? So I wanted to do this for my final presentation so that we begin to think about this issue of land rights, water rights, the environment, and the people who are fighting for those things, as we all should be. And this lead-in is important because today I'm going to engage you in a history of policing in the United States with a particular focus on BIPOC or Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities. My talk today is going to be twofold. The first fold is a brief history of policing in the United States and the different ways in which it evolved. And the second is how that history is still with us today. I'm going to start my talk with a notion that we have all been taught in this country, which is that the police are good. They do good things. They help the community. They fight crime, and that we can't do without them. Like many such narratives in US history, while this may be true for some, it has never, ever been true for Black people, Indigenous people, and Latinx folk. In fact, we should always question the we in such propositions because policing among especially Black people has actually been the opposite. Not good. Before we get into specifics, I'd like to introduce you to three terms that you see on this slide, which you may already be familiar with and which you may not. When I give my talks, I always try to leave people with some things that they can run with and things that get them thinking. And this series of terms, master narrative, meta narrative, actually come from, and counter narrative, actually come from Jean-Francois Lyotard, a French theorist and philosopher. And he argued that master narratives or grand narratives are the big stories that justify society and its power relations. So in this country, it would be the settlement of the Pilgrims, the US American Revolution, the melting pot, manifest destiny, capitalism are among the anchors of the US grand narrative. The historical plot of police as a benevolent institution that serves and protects is a meta narrative. It is a story among many that supports the grand tale. It is a story. What you are about to hear from me, though, is what is called counter narrative, which are narratives of histories intentionally silenced and or erased because they challenge the grand tale. Thus, as I mentioned last week, critical race theory and the 1619 Project are all under attack right now because they are being challenged. The grand narratives and meta narratives are being challenged by people who say we are not going to stand by this frame in which we are not in, this frame in which our histories and our experiences are not talked about. We are here, we've been here, and we have a particular history that we want included. And so the notion of counter narrative is including the things that challenge the master narrative. So I want you to look at this slide that I've prepared here for you. It's a pretty busy slide, but I wanted you to understand the master narrative is this notion of with liberty and justice for all, which it has really never been. And in fact, in the original Constitution, that was not the case. It might have been a lofty goal. It might still be a goal, but it has never come to be a reality for people of color. And then the meta narrative under there, you see, Mr. Cop and the three little kids, and he's nice and they're nice. That's a meta narrative. That's the narrative that supports the big thing, the good thing about America. And then I found this slide at the bottom from the US invasion into Hawaii in 1890s and the annexation of Hawaii. And I just wanted you to look at this slide because I see these stereotypical cartoons. They are used as a way to undermine our ability to be seen in our full humanity. So Queen Liliuokalani, there's a picture of her to the right of that slide, that is what she actually looked like. And she and the Hawaiian people put up a resistance in the 1880s and 1890s before the US took the island. And this is a political cartoon. It says Uncle Sam in Hawaii, and look at the way they portrayed her in a very stereotypical, and they did this with a lot of the colonial folks of color. They painted them all the same in a kind of Black minstrel, almost animalesque figure. And so that's also a meta narrative. It situates and makes people think that folks like the Queen was not worthy of their own monarchy and their own independence. And then I have other slides here that talk about this counter narrative in American history. One is the genocide of Native Americans by the colonists. The other is the taking of Mexico in 1848 in the war with Mexico. And of course, the common slide of enslaved Africans on a slave ship. And then the bottom is another political cartoon where Uncle Sam is looking at all the things he's going to get in the 1898 Spanish-American War. And he's looking, he's going to get Cuba, he's going to get Puerto Rico, he's going to get the Philippines, and the Sandwich Islands were actually what Hawaii was called back in the day. So what you're going to see here is not your mama's history or your 5th grade history textbook. It's what we call counter narrative history. So,
Dr. Brock,
yes, stop me.
I can't hear her. Okay. There we go. Is there a reason why we haven't heard some of this history before?
Well, you know, it's very interesting. It's a history that belies the kinds of tales and propaganda and outright lies that the U.S. likes to tell. It's so interesting. I was meeting the other day with the ambassador from South Africa here in Chicago, along with an assistant of hers, and he was telling me we were meeting at the Chicago Anti-Apartheid Movement collection, which is in an archives here in Chicago that I helped found. And we were meeting in there, and he was like, people in South Africa don't know about what you all did. They don't really know about what Americans did to support the anti-apartheid movement. But what they do know is American notions of democracy. And I said, well, how long have you been here? And he said, about 2 years. And I said, well, what do you think about that now? And he says, you won't know it until you get here, that actually for many people that the democracy actually doesn't work or apply to, and especially Black communities. He said he did not know that until he got here. So I think the reason this history is not told, because it undermines America's notions of itself as a democracy. And rather than grappling with this like they should, I mean, I think there's been some movement in it and telling the truth. There is a way to tell the truth in history, but they'd rather perpetuate the myth and the lie, largely so they can continue to do this. This is something that continues. And if it's hidden and ignored and denied, then the exploitation, which we talked about last week, the wage theft, the oppression can continue. So I think there are propaganda reasons why they don't want it, and there are also contemporary reasons why they don't want it. But I think it's important for us, and many of us have always worked in solidarity with each other as we challenge both the narrative and the reality of what the narrative brings upon us.
Sure.
Okay.
Dr. Brock, Joyce Broyles Hill asked in the Q&A section, how has the recent Supreme Court McGirt decision affected tribes outside of Oklahoma?
I don't know. Maybe they can tell me. And I think, and maybe we're going to get to some of these broader questions a little later, but I want to put a pin in that because I want them to come back and tell me about that. Maybe they're in Oklahoma. That would be wonderful.
Sounds great.
Okay. So should I proceed?
Yes.
Okay. So another term, as I move through here, there's something I want to just kind of raise up right now, and that is the term when I talk about Black Lives Matter in the streets and what we call putting street heat into motion. I see this as an uprising. So when I talk about what happened with Black Lives Matter in 2020, or what happened in 2014 in Ferguson, or what happened in Minnesota, I think, there's this notion that it's a riot. And I use the term here, uprising, when talking about Black Lives Matter protests, and not riot or looting. Both terms are class-based and have their origins in Europe when the poor chose to rise up against monarchies. In fact, looting, which signifies taking something that is not yours or stealing, was applied when applied without class distinction, makes it look as if there's this universal thing that we call looting. But if we think about it, and if taking something that's not yours is based on volume and amount of what is stolen, one can say that banks are looting our college students, employers are looting labor, Tax benefits to schools are looted to pay for the civil suits paid for police misconduct, etc. So I'm going to leave that there for now, and we'll probably circle back on some of that. I'm going to talk about 4 origins of the police in the US today. First, a definition. Police, according to Merriam-Webster Dictionary, is the department of government concerned primarily with the maintenance of public order, safety, and health and enforcement of laws, and the police possess executive, judicial, and legislative powers. The department of government concerned primarily with the maintenance of public order, safety, and health and enforcement of laws, and possessing executive, judicial, and legislative powers. This definition is very important and should raise all of our critical thinking skills to ask certain questions as I go through these 4 origin stories of policing in the US, such as whose order, for what purposes, whose health and safety, and if police really possess executive, judicial, and legislative powers, which they do, should they? The very first policing in the United States occurred during the US colonial era in the 13 colonies, and its purpose was to maintain the order of enslavement. There is no doubt that the origin of policing in the United States started with enslavement. These early forces were called patrollers and later slave patrollers. Their role was to keep the public order of the institution of enslavement. In other words, to keep Black people forcibly and violently enslaved. This slide here is a woodcut print. Was published in the Anti-Slavery Almanac in 1839, and it's from Georgia. And for a lot of people today, probably you're going to see drawings because they did not have cameras back then. So people drew examples of what was going on, and sometimes people drew what they saw. Georgia actually passed its first Patroller Act in 1757 at its colonial assembly, asserting that slave insurrections must be prevented. So they passed the act for establishing and regulating of patrols. And it was passed, and it read that white men not exceeding 7 would work in districts 12 miles square. The statute ordered all white male adults to ride the roads at night, to ride the roads during the day, stopping all slaves they encountered and making them prove that they were engaged in lawful activities. Does this sound familiar? I don't know where you live, but I see police stopping Black folks all the time for no reason. Asking them questions, why are they there? Patrollers required slaves to produce a pass, which stated their owner's name as well as where and when they were allowed to be away from the plantation and for how long. Do we have any questions, any comments? I'm not leaving this topic.
No questions or comments at this time.
Okay. Interestingly, all whites had to do this, even if you didn't own those who were being enslaved. The non-owner group, as you can imagine, of whites complained and felt that they were serving the interests of the planter class, and they took issue to the assembly. They took issue with this and took their complaints to the assembly. By the early 19th century, it became necessary to pay people to perform what had been voluntarily unpaid policing service. And these people were often poor whites. And the planter class, I'm sure, was actually probably relieved that they didn't have to do this work on their own. Therefore, this is a very important point because it included the poor white classes in the project of violently reinforcing Black enslavement, and clearly separated them from the enslaved, even though they were poor, many of them very, very poor. And I think this is important because this is one of the moments, and there are many others, where race trumped class in American history, and white supremacy increasingly becomes a thing among all whites. In fact, if you really look at this woodcut slide, this appears to be a multi-class group of white men. Some have top hats and coats of the upper classes, and others have caps and clothes of the lower classes. So in 1819, Savannah's City Watch received $1 for every evening they served and shared in any reward for the forced return of a runaway. The multi-class white participation in oppression is what Eric Said called the other, based on perceived color, was somewhat unique in history. I mentioned this last week. While there was slavery and forced labor in ancient and Middle Age time, all over the world in one way or another, they rarely were based on what was to become known as race. I have often stated that this multi-class, multi-white ethnic coming together was indeed important to the development of racism in our society. And I'm going to turn to some slides here. These are some images from the 18th and 19th century of patrollers stopping the enslaved. And when I saw this, when I discovered this slide, because the slide on the left was a new one for me. I was doing some research for this talk, and I saw that man on a horse with a whip. It reminded me of what we saw on the border with Haitians. And in fact, someone mentioned in Twitter that I know that the Border Patrol people have said that won't happen again and blah, blah, blah. But if they were whipping a dog or a white person, that person would lose their job. I don't know what happened to those that whipped the Haitians. I hope at least that they lose their job. Also, I should note that the pass system you see in this second slide, Blacks had to show paperwork to show that they had a right to be there. They had to be okayed to be there by a white person, normally their owner, to move around. And of course, this reminded me also of South Africa and the apartheid system, which required Blacks to carry a pass. These are images of, this should strike you in some ways. These are images of the badges that the patrollers wore, and we begin to see the term police used in this way. This was the plantation police from Georgetown County, 1858, South Carolina, runaway slave patrol. This one we see begins to have the star of what is now known as a policeman's badge. This is a book that was written about slave patrols, if you're interested. And then these are regulations for slave patrollers in Tarboro, North Carolina. So it was a huge effort, and it was a huge effort because the enslaved were often, always resisting and running away. There is an estimated 250,000 runaway ads that were put in newspapers around the country between 1619 and 1863. And I encourage everyone on this call to go, just Google runaway slave ads. And you just see this huge, and do image, you just see this huge number come up from all over the country. They existed in the North, they existed in the South. Do we have any questions?
I thought I unmuted, Dr. Brock. Yes, we do have a question.
Okay.
Someone had made a comment in the chat earlier about white people stopping in policing Black people. So could you speak on white civilian policing of Black people as we see it manifest even more today?
That's a great question, because actually I have a whole thing on that as we get to the legacies. But this is a legacy of enslavement, of course, that all whites consider themselves police. I remember a statement from South Africa that said, blacks see all whites as police, and whites see all blacks as servants. And in many ways, I think in this country, it's very clear that all whites see the police as their personal valets of racism. And they think that they can stop Black people, and they take on the kind of white citizen patrol that started in this time. So it's not surprising that that happens. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that as we move through this. As the legacies.
I just want to acknowledge, for those who did not see in the chat, Dr. Taylor put in a free runaway slave ads link. So if you want to take a look at that, that would be great too.
I mean, I'm doing research on this right now, and these ads, you have to keep in mind, this is before photographs. And so these ads have so much detail in them. This one up here says, runaway or stolen from subscriber living in Morehouse Parish, Louisiana, a Negro man named Jerry, about 35 or 40 years of age, very Black, about 5'8" high, very intelligent, having full eyes and a clear scar on the right side of his neck. I mean, these ads are really rich to talk about sort of the surveillance of Black bodies, and the fact that what was known about Black bodies, which to me is so interesting. On the one hand, Black people and their humanity is ignored, but as property, their bodies were studied and surveilled so that they could keep up with them. So very, very interesting resource for research. The second form of police, as I said, we're talking about it in BIPOC communities. The second form of police, which was really a colonial police force aimed at policing an occupied territory, are the Texas Rangers. It's so interesting to me when you think about the TV show. There was a TV show called Texas Ranger, and they were such good guys. Remember, I talked about the meta narrative and the master narrative. They were formed in 1834 when a few hundred white settlers under their leader, Stephen Austin, moved into Texas in an attempt to take Texas after the Mexican War of Independence, which was in 1821 from Spain. And if you look at this slide, I mean, look at this one on the left. Dead Mexican bandits killed at border of Norlo's Ranch, Tex-Mex border. Again, I ask the question, who's the bandit here? This was Mexico. One should also note that the Monroe Doctrine was passed in 1823, claiming a manifest destiny from sea to shining sea. The problem was that peoples already lived there and therefore had to be removed. The 1830s was also the time of the Trail of Tears, following passage of the Indian Removal Act of 1830, which mandated that all most indigenous folk east of the Mississippi be moved west. Andrew Jackson was president at the time. He was also known as the Butcher of New Orleans because of fighting there. It should come as no surprise that the former President Trump had a portrait put up of Andrew Jackson installed in the Oval Office behind him. So this was his hero, Andrew Jackson. The third form of policing emerged in the northern cities after the Civil War, where the economic and political elite in power controlled the police forces. It's very interesting that sort of urban policing. We've all heard of patronage politics in a lot of cities in the 1920s and 30s in Chicago and New Orleans and Philadelphia and New York and Boston. This is an image of the New York City Metropolitan Police in 1871. This is where patronage started. I mean, literally, the police were hired and fired. The police chiefs were hired and fired by mayors. And the police chiefs would order their men to engage in political campaigning and to harass political opponents, sort of like a group of hired thugs. Police were also instructed to engage in social welfare for white citizens in order to maintain party loyalty and to secure white male votes. By the latter 19th century, as Black immigrant numbers increased in cities, preserving social order and protecting the property of the mercantile classes became the primary task of police forces. Can I say that again? Preserving social order and protecting the property of the mercantile classes became the primary task of police forces. Does that not sound familiar? As police studies scholar Gary Porter has noted, what constitutes social and public order depends largely on who is defining the terms. I would add that to that crime. You know, I mentioned the whole issue of, what is crime last week. Crime has always been largely defined as the petty theft and disturbances of the poor, the Black, the indigent, and working classes, not high crimes and misdemeanor of the rich. I'll stop right here and see if there's any questions.
Yes, Dr. Brock. Actually, Dr. Delaney, if he wants to unmute, had a great question for you a couple of slides back, but I missed him, but now I found him.
Okay.
Yeah, before we get too far away from the slave patrol, I wonder if you would explain the power and policies of the slave patrol, particularly in terms of how they established the policing of African Americans.
Why don't you share that with us?
Okay, well, what I always try to emphasize is that the slave patrol had almost ultimate power over enslaved people. You know, you and I discussed earlier that in most cases, they attempted to keep the enslaved people alive because the enslaved people were valuable in terms of work and so on. But at the same time, the slave patrol was given this absolute ultimate power to whip, to abuse, to confiscate property. And of course, if this enslaved person got too unruly, to even kill them without any, recompense for that. So I wanted to make that point, particularly as we move toward the future in your presentation. And I'll stop there.
No, that's perfect, because the issue is when we look at that Walter Scott video, and I thought about putting that in here, but I did not want to cause trauma again. But Walter Scott is a man running away. Most Blacks are killed while they are not threatening to police, physically threatening. And Walter Scott was actually running away, and the police shot him multiple times in the back and killed him. And that comes in my mind from a history of believing that when you as a white authority figure say, stop, do what I say, you a slave, that if you don't do that, you don't have a right to run away if you're Black.
Exactly.
You don't have a right to say, I got rights. You don't have a right to do anything that challenges that power. And that power comes from this history. And I don't even think very often white cops have even dissected in their heads. They just know it is normal and true.
Yes. Right. There's no Fourth Amendment rights for African Americans, basically. And of course, going all the way back to the colonial times.
Right.
Okay. Thank you.
Well, thank you. And I mean, I think, and I'm gonna show some of this white citizen policing and all of this stuff as we get into this. But each of them does have a legacy to today. Each one of so the slave patrollers, And remember I said that the definition of a police is that they possess all powers of life and death in their code. They can decide whether you live or die. Um, um, and they know that for us, the penalties are much less than if they were to kill a white person. So these are urban police. This is a uniform of urban policing. One of the interesting things about urban policing is that many of the white immigrants that were flooding into the cities came to America with some kind of class consciousness. And it developed in industrializing Europe where there were very few people of color. And so you have these disturbances happening all over the country in the late 18th century, late 19th century in terms of working class rights and conditions. So this is a slide of urban police putting down the Haymarket uprising of workers organizing for the 8-hour workday. I don't know if many of our young students, I know I talk to young people, and sometimes they don't understand that the rights that workers have today, however limited they are, had to come out of struggle, that it did not come out of just some benevolence of the society. Almost everything that poor people have gained, and of course Black people have gained, have come out of serious engagement and struggle. So this was the Haymarket uprising, where they were fighting for the 8-hour day, May 1st to the 4th of 1886. Several workers and police were killed after a bomb was thrown in the crowd. 4 workers ended up being hanged, even though it was never proven that any of them threw the bomb. In case you didn't know, a major Black woman and her husband were organizers of Haymarket and the working class. She was the founder of the Ladies Garment Workers Union. She was a seamstress, and her name was Lucy Gomez Parsons. This movement, of which she and her husband were a part of, and her husband was killed in this, was one of the ones killed in the Haymarket when they killed the 4. And she went on to continue to be a labor organizer. This movement is what led to May 1st being considered around the world as International Workers' Day, and why we don't have it here. And we don't celebrate May 1st here. We celebrate it in September, which was a compromise because this was an affront to police powers and to those wealthy elites who were determined not to celebrate a holiday like this. Any questions?
Not at the moment.
Okay. I think when we get to the contemporary, we'll have a lot more. I'm dropping some science on them right now. I'm dropping some science. As my students say, I'm leading class right now. So slide 10 represents the 4th type of police force. And it was the first major move to include Black people into a post-Civil War, into the US military forces. We often hear that if we had more Black policemen, that things would be better. I don't think that has been proven to be the case, especially when one looks at the very first attempt at inclusion, the Buffalo Soldiers, Colin Powell's heroes. The Buffalo Soldiers were African-American soldiers, as you can see here, who mainly served on the Western frontier following the Civil War. In 1866, 6 all-Black cavalry and infantry regiments were created after Congress passed the Army Organization Act. Their main tasks were to help control the Native Americans of the plains, protect white settlers from Indians and Mexicans, to protect stagecoaches, wagon trains, and railroad crews along the Western frontier. In other words, to protect the colonial expansion of the US government west against the folk who already lived there. The Buffalo Soldiers were so good that at what they did, that they were called up to participate in what is known here, what is known in the US as the Spanish-American War. And I want to settle here a bit because it raises a huge contradiction. It came up last week when we were talking about Black capitalism and the issue of how I said I support collectives and cooperatives and things that don't do harm to people. And if you have if you're an entrepreneur and you're making something that people need, and you share the resources that you get from that, if in fact you make a lot of profit, then I think that's good. But the issue of Black capitalism, like the US state government, is a project rooted in enslavement and white supremacy and colonialism. And so for us to be involved in a project without kind of thinking about the consequences of that, it means that we're going to be involved in the exploitation, colonization, and support of policies that we may not individually actually believe in. So this is the 24th US Infantry in the Philippines in 1902. And they were most of them were former Buffalo soldiers. Now, I will say, because I've done some research in this area, I will say that there were a lot of African Americans who stood in solidarity with the people of the Philippines, the people of Cuba, the people of Puerto Rico, the people of Hawaii, and the people of Guam, who were fighting for their own independence, and they wanted to not be colonized or annexed by the US. So it was a huge contradiction, and many Blacks did not support it. But also many Blacks understood that if in fact, or they believed that if in fact we were going to be ever achieve equality in this country, that we might have to fight and prove our loyalty. And so this was the kind of debate that's happened in every American war.
Dr. Brock, we had a question pop up in our Q&A from a couple slides ago.
Okay.
A.M. Signer asked, did these workers' protests lead to the establishment of Pinkertons?
I don't know if it's a direct connection, but yes. The organizing of unions led to union busting, extra state military groups like Pinkertons that went in to destroy unions. Yes.
Thank you. That was our own.
And this was not the only strike. I mean, the railroad strike was huge, and it was happening around the same time. And so the government, people were striking. There was destabilization, and so the U.S. government came up with some compromises, and they did allow for the 8-hour day. I mean, we have to keep in mind, and it's funny, we're gonna have to fight for the 8-hour day again, because so many people are forced to work long hours just to live because the wages are so diminished, and because of wage theft. And I also think we have to fight for unions again as well. Not think, I know we do, because we've been in a period where the unions have been attacked, not by Pinkertons, but by policy and by propaganda. Yes, a lot of union activity in the late 1800s and also in the 1930s led to union busting.
Thank you, Dr. Brock. That was our only question.
Okay. Now we're going to get to the legacies, and I'm going to say a couple of things. We've heard about the efforts all around the country to defund or abolish the police. And we can see where this comes from. It's rooted in the role that police have played and continue to play in our history and in our neighborhoods, which has been to subjugate Black, Indigenous, and Latinx folk to the will of first the planter class and now the 1%. I wanted to say something too about working class before I continue. I don't know if you all have noticed, I stayed at a hotel recently in Kalamazoo, Michigan, and they normally have a valet service if you're going to stay there that parks your cars. It was a Radisson. And there was no valet service because the sign said, we have no valet service because we can't find workers. And there's this whole discussion now where the right says people don't want to work, and people who have been working in underpaid, horrific jobs are saying, we don't want to work for those wages. So we're in an interesting period right now, and we see it all over the country. It'll be interesting to see, because I actually asked one of the managers at the hotel why they couldn't find valets, and he said, well, they don't want to work for what we pay them. And I said, what do you pay them? And he said $6 an hour because they believe in tips. And so anyway, I just wanted to mention that before we move on. You know, James Baldwin talked about the police really are occupiers in Black neighborhoods. And their goal is to keep Black people in their place, much like if the goal was to keep enslaved people enslaved in their place. It is this history that lies behind police murdering Blacks and Indigenous folks who do not follow their orders. It's about maintaining the racial order, not justice. I included here some artwork from folks I know. There's been a lot of art about what's been happening recently with the exposure of police killings. It's interesting that cities like Chicago, where I live, paid $33 million to police the schools, and $113 million in 2018 in police misconduct settlements. Which I think, if you really think about this, what we discovered with the Laquan McDonald's case here in Chicago is that if there's no one filming the murder, or if the video gets suppressed, then what has been quietly happening is the city council will watch the video, and they will bring the family in, and they will offer the family money if the family signs non-disclosure settlements, agreements. And if you just really think about this, what our society is saying is that it's okay to kill Black people, and we'll just pay the family, as if paying the family brings that person back. This has been the normal policy here in Chicago. And it's just, and of course the family can't talk about it. And usually these are poor families, they take the money, the person's already gone. But it's something kind of nasty and ugly about that process. I'm gonna let the police kill you, the city says, and then we'll pay you for their death. Something we need to think about. So the whole notion of defunding the police is talking about using that funding so that people don't get killed. Use that funding for schools, use that funding for daycare centers, use that funding for places where healthy beings can be produced. I just wanted to share a couple of things here. This is just Al Jazeera, Aliyah site. There are many sites that you can go to that have the names of people who were killed by police and what they were doing. This young man was driving with his girlfriend in Minnesota. Andre Hill, 47, emerged from a garage and holding up a cell phone in his left hand in Columbus, Ohio. Manuel Ellis, 33, walking home from a convenience store, Tacoma, Washington. Rashard Brooks, 27, he fell asleep in his car blocking the drive-through lane at a fast food restaurant. So I just share this with you because the names are in the thousands, and it has not ended. Oh, shoot. Let me just do that. It has not ended since the murder of George Floyd. It's always so interesting to me that people think when there's an uprising and everything that somehow police stop doing what they do. And that has not been the case of year after year after year. When James Baldwin talked about a so-called riot or uprising that happened in New York in 1964. He said it was just the overflowing of the bitter cup of occupation and oppression. And that was in 1964. And so this legacy of police shootings, because that's what happened in Harlem, and people rising up is something that continues. I think this movement of abolishment and defunding the police at least gets a different kind of discussion started, Any questions? I want to show you something else too.
Go ahead. Oh, we just had a comment in the chat from Ronald Saunders. It says, we need to be very clear about the role of the Buffalo Soldiers of the 9th plus 10th Cavalry played in the genocide of America's first victims of white racism, who were the indigenous tribes on the northern and southern plains. Indeed, American history is complicated, complex, and often confusing on how Native indigenous tribes interacted with Africans free and enslaved as they struggled to survive on lands they had lived on for thousands of years.
Yeah, I really appreciate that comment, because it's complex, because there were African Americans who were harbored and supported by indigenous tribes and nations all over the country. And then there were Indians who got involved in enslavement. And then there were free Blacks who also were involved in some ways in enslavement. So it is complicated, partly because when you live in a system that only offers you certain possibilities, people often take one or the other. It's not always easy to not participate in some way, at least economically, in the society in which you were born. So it's contradictory and it's complex. But I like to look to the histories like of the Seminoles and the histories of solidarity and how we work on that history today as well. And there were always people that pushed those connections, just like I said with the Black soldiers that went to Hawaii and the Philippines. Many of them did not like what they were doing there, just like in Vietnam. A lot of Black soldiers, I don't know if you remember that saying, Muhammad Ali said, "No Vietnamese ever called me the N-word." So he was building solidarity with the Vietnamese people. But it's very difficult when your options are limited and you live in a certain kind of society. So it is complex. So I want to show you how art has responded to this as well. Any comments? Everybody's quiet. Can you hear me?
We're hearing
Yes,
in the chat. Oh, go ahead, Christina.
Sorry, yeah. Thanks, Eileen. There's we're waiting on people to answer in the chat. We've got a loved it, powerful, that was deep. Was upset we had to turn it off early. Beautiful, poetic, deep, very, very moving.
Okay, yes, that's a Black tap dance troupe in Oregon. You might want to look them up. And then I was going to share right here. I say Trayvon, Tucson, and me, and I probably should put Emmett in there too because of Emmett Till, which is the next slide. When an interesting personal story, and I'm sure a lot of people have personal stories, especially Black mothers of children, Black boys and Black girls. And I remember when Trayvon was murdered, and then his murderer, Zimmerman, got off, and how we all felt that rage and that anger. And at my previous institution, we held a vigil and a kind of town hall about Trayvon and then what had happened with his murderer. And I remember mentioning in the talk, my statement, I actually said that as a mother, I was thinking about Trayvon and Emmett, and what they said about Emmett Till. The reason they killed him is because he didn't appear afraid. And of course, Zimmerman killed Trayvon because he wouldn't let him kill him. He fought back. And I remember saying that with my son, I would love for my son to live. My son's name is Toussaint. I would love for my son to live if, in fact, he encountered white citizen policing, or if I'd want him to live, but I actually would prefer that he fight for his life, even if it meant that he was killed. And I remember some people coming up to me saying, "How can you say that?" And I said, because I don't want my son to go down scared. I want him to fight. I want to fight. So I remember, some of the white folks in the audience were crying because I said that. Because basically a person has two choices: to fight back or to act like a coward. And so I just wanted to share that with you.
Dr. Brock, we have a hand raised from Anita Russell, and I'm not sure if she wanted to share, but I'm going to allow her to talk to see if she had something she wanted to say in regards to what we've discussed thus far, if that's okay with you.
Okay.
Can
Anita?
you hear me?
Yes.
I was actually wanting to comment on the video with the tap dance.
Mhm.
And I guess what I wanted to just iterate or reiterate is the fact that saying their names has such a social implication. It's a very strong implication. It's a very heavy implication, because as we all know how easily we can get re-identified as a Black male, a Black female, a Black teen. And although some people might just kind of get to the point where it's like, oh my gosh, how many times are you going to say their name? But to your point about your son going down fighting, I say we say their names as long as we have to fight, because those names could potentially not even be the last of the names that we have to say. So we have to keep saying them and saying them and saying them until things begin to crumble. I mean, it kind of reminds me of in the Bible when the Israelites had to blow the horn and then the walls finally started to crumble down. It's kind of that kind of thing. We have to keep fighting, and saying their names is a part of that fight.
Yes, yes, yes. I agree. And we have to, we because they were here. They have to be remembered. They have to be remembered. Thank you. And I wanted to say, I didn't sort of say that the legacy number one is police occupying our neighborhoods, don't run away, don't stand up for yourself, murder, and the murders that continue to happen by police. And legacy number two is white citizen policing, which someone raised earlier. Each of these people on this slide were killed by white folks who had no business, except white business, in trying to put these Black people in their place and kill them. So as you know, Emmett was just young and Black. Arbery was jogging while Black. Trayvon was going to store while Black. And I'm going to show a little bit more about white citizen policing too.
Dr. Brock, we have a couple other hands raised.
Okay.
We have one from Otiana Thompson. So I'm gonna give her an opportunity.
How you doing? Can you hear me?
Yes. Hi, Atiana.
It's Otiana, but you can call me OT.
Otiana. I'm sorry, OT. OT?
Yeah, you can call me OT. I'm a
Okay.
student at Claflin University. I'm doing some research on racial capitalism. So I'm really mad I missed the last session, but I'm also looking at how it links to policing. And I wanted to know, in what way do you see the way Black public life is framed in today's society, and as we saw it back in the 20th century, and how there was many different class distinctions, as we can see in the Black community with the wealth gap. But do you recognize that many of the issues that the lower class is fighting for, the upper class is straying away from, even though they recognize that you're always going to be Black regardless of your economic status? Like I'm thinking about Cedric Johnson's book, Revolutionaries to Race Leaders, and he talks about how the Black public life must become interested in the working class's interests, regardless of your economic status, if we want to move the race forward. But nowadays, especially when it comes to like policing and defund the police, is like people of a certain wealth status are shying away from organizing with the working class. And I want to know, and in what way can I move my research forward by understanding that? Like, is there a mental shift or any sources that you have? Because I'm, as a young person, I'm also trying to understand, because I don't want to become a part of that class again.
Yes, yes. Claflin. You know, my son Toussaint went to Claflin.
Oh, that's amazing.
That's amazing. And my good friend Millicent Brown taught there for years. Well, I think this is an interesting issue. I think the majority of Black people are going to be working class in this society, the majority. And the majority, and then if you add middle class Blacks, and what we might call a Black elite, which is actually relatively small, they are still going to be impacted by racism. I think the struggles normally come from the bottom up, and people decide to be a part of it or not. I think, you know, in terms of the police, of course, the police represent those in power and those with money. And I think a lot of Black people who have some money think the police are going to protect them too. But I remember when Abdul, what's his name? The basketball player, the tall basketball player.
Kareem Abdul-Jabbar.
Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. He was stopped by the police in LA, and the police were, you know, either they act like they didn't know who he was, or they did and actually wanted to put him back in his place. And I think we see a lot of wealthy athletes also stepping up now. So I guess if I was to lead you in your research, I wouldn't spend so much time on internal dynamics in the Black community. I would spend more time on the movements within the Black community. That's what I would do. And people will come along or they won't. I do think that a lot of Black people, even poor working class people who've been victimized by crime, as we say, you know, they've been robbed or stuck up, they think sometimes more police will help. So not everybody is here yet. I did mention last week that a lot of ideas that get, a lot of sort of theories and frames and paradigms that get spoken, that the consciousness is there for some, but not for many, but we speak it so that we can organize around it and bring more people toward it. So I mean, I remember when Angela Davis was talking about abolishing the prisons, you know, 30 years ago, 40 years ago, and people were like, oh, that's not going to ever happen or ever take hold. And now it's taken hold. So I really do think this notion of defunding the police, especially since city budgets claim to be so strained, they claim they don't have money for schools, for public schools, but somehow they have money for police. I think that is a discussion that we can actually have and that we can win. And also making police accountable. Chicago just passed the city council resolutions to make police more accountable. Now, what will it do? How will it pan out? Will it become just another rubber stamp on something? We're not sure. But people are fighting and winning in some places around these issues. So I say look at the movements and don't worry about the Black upper classes, because they're fragile and tangential at best in the whole scheme of things.
Dr. Bach, we got one more hand for now, and then we can move on.
Okay.
Our hand is from, oops, what am I doing? Reverend Alvin Riley.
Okay.
Yes, good evening. I just wanted to comment about the importance of saying the name. Um, I think it's for all of us to remember and to know, because otherwise they become like many in our heritage. They're faceless, nameless ancestors. There's people that are there. When I was working as a dean of students, I had to um, I tried to introduce during Black History Month about the 16th church bombing, but if you notice, all these years, no one said the names of those girls. You know, people, we always refer to them as four little girls, four little girls. And before I retired from that position, I, I put forth, I said, somebody, and there was a play that we were going to do about the four little girls with their names, because most people, like even now, even though we did the play and I've gone to a number of things, events, I can't recall their names off the top of my head, probably because there's too many names now. The list keeps growing as we speak, but it is important that they don't become faceless, personless, and because I think that's what happened with, the four little girls, because most people don't know their names. They just know them as four little girls. And I'm like, well, they had names, they had lives, they had families, and I think part of it, even for white folks, the more we say the name, it tends to humanize them.
Yes.
To let them know that these were people.
Yeah.
These weren't just animals. I mean, when you look at animals, it's like they don't have names unless we have them as pets and give them names.
That's right.
But then, and that's how why it's important. So I want to thank you, because I for this particular presentation, because I was recently asked to serve on a conversation beginning around policing in my neck of the woods. So
Well, I'm glad this has been helpful.
thank you. They're very helpful.
Yeah,
Very helpful.
thank you. And the other thing too is what often happens is once a Black person is killed, then all of a sudden they try to destroy them and their memory in death, and they try to say they were this or they were that, or they should have done this or they should have done that. And the reality is I don't know about the $20 bill supposedly that George Floyd passed. And I don't care. I don't care. It wasn't worth his life. It wasn't worth his life. So anyway. So white citizen policing is a huge thing, as we've seen before, but there's a subset of this that I call legacy number 3. And I said it a little earlier, and someone mentioned it, is policing police as your personal avatar or valet of racism. I got this from Jamilis Lartey, who works at the Marshall Project. If you all don't know the Marshall Project, you should definitely Google it. It's named after Thurgood Marshall, and it's a group of journalists that are working around civil and human rights, primarily of Black people. And we've seen this, white individuals seeing police as their personal avatar, valet of racism, when they think they can call the police on absolutely anything that Black people do. And I'm not, in the interest of time, I'm not going to show everything, but I think we've heard about Amy Cooper in New York and Central Park, the woman who basically unleashed her dog, and the bird watcher there asked her to put a leash on her dog, as she was required to in that area. And this woman, Amy Cooper, said, I'm going to call the police. And then when she calls the police, she says she's being harassed by an African-American man because she knows that has agency with the police. And then we had Barbecue Becky, who out in Oakland decided that people who had been barbecuing in Merritt Park no longer could barbecue there because she was there, and she called the police. She was called out, and like a lot of these people, they end up hiding, they end up crying, they end up, you know, whatever after they get called out. But that turn, that kind of turn to call the police on Black people comes from the history of enslavement and the fact that Black people are oppressed, and they know that, and they know the police will be on their side when the police come. And so I wanted to play, I said Noah Trevor, Trevor Noah. So this is a whole compilation of Trevor Noah talking about various permit patties and barbecue Becky's. And I think there was a corner store, Carolyn, in New York City, who young 9-year-old boy's backpack brushes up against her, and she calls the police saying a 9-year-old kid was trying to touch her behind. So it's quite funny. And just like art, like with the tap dancing, sometimes levity is also important for our health, our mental health and our psyche. And I'm about at the end. The fourth type of policing is really policing the colonial borders on territories that were stolen. A lot of Mexican activists say we didn't cross the border crossed us. As we heard some years ago, it's not in the news as much, but I'm sure it's still going on, is that many immigrants are being jailed at the border. And one thing I wanted to note, and we know what happened with the Haitians at the border recently. One of the things I wanted to note too, there's a wonderful book called Policing the Planet, and it was written by Jordan Camp and Christina, her last name is the past, Heatherton, Christina Heatherton and Jordan Camp, called Policing the Planet. And one of the things I learned in there is that police are actually killing Indians at a higher rate per capita than Black people. And when I thought about the history of policing in our country, and I thought about, and what the Dr. Delaney said is that, you know, they would, when Black people were enslaved, they wanted to keep us alive as much as possible if we understood our place. But for Indigenous Americans, the goal was to kill them. So the fact that Indians are being killed at a higher rate makes some sense given the history of genocide and enslavement. And I just had a couple of slides here just so you can see the difference. There's nothing normal about American society. Police killings by country, in terms of industrialized country, we see the United States in 2014, and we see Germany, the UK, Australia, Japan. We see Finland, bullets fired by police in 2013, only 6 in a population of 5.4 million. In Washington, in a town in Washington, 17 bullets were fired in the fatal shooting of 1 person in a population of 67,599. So higher numbers, fewer people, and then only in 1 person. This statistic about Ferguson to show that police stops. So when people rose up in Ferguson, it was not simply because they killed and had to watch poor Mike Brown die in the middle of the street. It's because they had been subjected to police violence and stopping and searching all the time. New York City. This helps you see LA, 70.3% of its budget goes to fire and police. In Chicago, that dark green of the pie goes to police. When people say they don't have money in these cities. They've got money to pay for police, but they don't have money to do other things. Because again, when we think about racial capitalism, OT, police are really about keeping the status quo, right? And then I just wanted to end here in Chicago. They were the mayor has been trying to build and has already started building a $95 million training center for cops. At the same time that we had schools being shut down in the city of Chicago. So these are actually young middle school and high school students who started a No Cop Academy and led a major campaign to try to stop this. And they did stall it for a few years. But I just wanted you to see some of the beautiful faces of young people fighting for schools and to defund the police. And I'll stop there and we can take questions, comments. Thank you. Sorry for the tech issue.
Thank you, Dr. Brock. I don't see any questions or comments, just some people saying thank you. Thank you for providing this presentation. A lot of people said it's very informative. I did want to say I did add those links that she talked about into the chat for you to review those articles that she shared about Native American policing and killing the Native Lives Matter in the chat as well. But thank you, Dr. Brock. I'm gonna hand it over to Michelle.
Thank you for joining us this evening for our third session. And we hope you'll come back next week. Next week on October 6th, we'll be talking about This is What Democracy Looks Like: Street Heat, Voting, and the Power of Community Mapping, which will be presented by Dr. Serena Sebring. And our final and fifth session will occur on October 13th, exploring the impact of mass incarceration, Humans of Life Role and the Work of Ethical Storytelling, presented by Alice Kim and Emily Hooper Lansana. Thank you for participating this evening, and we look forward to having more feedback from you. And Dr. Brock, as always, thank you so much for educating us tonight.
Thank you.
Have a wonderful weekend, all.
Okay, you too.
A wonderful evening.